this morning? Wow, that was underwhelming. But I feel you. All right, I'll just say a prayer before I get started. Dear Jesus, thank you for the ability to meet here and commune with you and our fellow Christians here today. Please be with me as I speak today, and I hope that the words that I speak are your words and that it means something to these people. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, I want to tell you a story today. My mum was an EALD teacher. EALD means English as another language or dialect. And she was this type of teacher for over 25 years, and she's just retired. She's had many refugee students from many countries, and she's become a maternal figure to a lot of these people. Sometimes I've joked that my mum loved her students more than she loved us kids. And also sometimes we joke that she loves her cats more than her kids. But the experiences that all of these people have had, they needed the love. So today I'm going to tell you about Eid. Eid is Hazara. Has anyone heard of the Hazara people? Nikki has. I'll tell you about it, and Shri has heard of the Hazara. I'll tell you. The Hazara people are a predominantly Shia ethnic minority in Afghanistan, have faced systemic persecution for centuries. They're believed to be descendants of Mongol warriors from Genghis Khan's era, and have long been marginalised due to their distinct features, language and religious beliefs. During the 19th century, a campaign was launched against them, leading to mass killings, enslavement and displacement. In more recent times, the Taliban and other extremist groups have continued to target Hazaras through massacres, bombings and discrimination. Despite constitutional protections, they remain vulnerable to sectarian violence, economic marginalisation and political exclusion, making them one of Afghanistan's most oppressed communities. This is when the nerves kicked in. So, when Eid was 4 years old, and his sister Karima too, and I'm not actually sure about the older brother, but he seems a few years older, his father left Afghanistan and took Eid and his brother to Pakistan. And during this process, he divorced his wife and left Karima, the daughter, behind. When he arrived in Pakistan, the father married another woman there, but they were only married for a short time, and then he decided to leave her too, and he left Eid and his brother behind with her this time. He fled to Australia as an illegal immigrant via boat. He ended up in Gatton, working on farms as a contractor, and eventually, after working hard for a few years, he got his Australian citizenship. Once he got his citizenship, he decided to go back to Pakistan to collect Eid and his brother. The father divorced the second wife, married a new woman, and then decided to take the boys and his new wife back to Australia. Eid was 12 at this point, and the woman he had to leave behind had been his mother for 8 years. No one knows what happened to the second wife since she was left behind. It was at this point when Eid and his brother arrived in Australia that Eid started at Lockyer High School. Oh, I'm sorry, Nikki. I'm getting the same way. They arrived at Lockyer High School in Year 8, and he met my mum. This is when I start crying. She was his ESL, as it was called back then, or his EALD teacher. And she looked after Eid all through high school as his English teacher. And even after he finished school, they remained in contact. During this time, Eid's father ended up bringing his new wife's brothers back to Australia. And when Eid's father's new wife had kids, his father decided to go back to Afghanistan to collect Karima and take her away from their mother. By this time, Eid and Karima's mother had remarried, but the purpose that their father intended for Karima was for her to look after the men in the family. She had no autonomy. Her job was to serve. In this culture, pretty much women are worthless, as I can tell you so far. Karima wasn't even finished high school when her father decided to arrange a marriage for her to a friend of his back in Pakistan. She didn't want to marry this man in Pakistan, and she was really terrified. She didn't know this man, and I think he was much older than her. Karima told my mum that she'd actually been promised to a man back in Afghanistan who she was comfortable marrying. I remember this time, years ago, Mum telling our family about it, and many people ended up praying for Karima. In what I feel is a very unusual circumstance, their mother in Afghanistan appealed to their father in Australia that Karima wanted to marry this Afghani man that she had been originally promised to. And so Eid and Karima went back to Afghanistan for Karima's marriage to this proposed Afghani man. Otherwise, she would have been forced to marry this other man in Pakistan. So Karima married Aziz. And while they were there, Eid met Shakila, a lovely young girl. They both got along together very well. And so Shakila's family gave permission for her to marry Eid. But this meant she had to leave everything behind to come back here. So in the end, all four of them came back to Australia. When they returned to Australia, Eid and Karima then had to move back into their family home and spent a while applying for spousal visas for Aziz and Shakila. Once these were processed, all four moved out and lived together in a little apartment. They all worked really hard on farms in Gatton once again, and once they had earned enough between them, both couples bought blocks of land and built houses in Placid Hill, which is near Gatton. Eid and Shakila now have 2 children. They're extremely cute, and Karima and Aziz have 3, and as I say, they're all extremely cute. The youngest is 4 months old. Meanwhile, back in Afghanistan, the Taliban had invaded Kabul. Anyone who had a connection with a Western power like America or Australia were hunted down and either killed or jailed. Eid's mother and her new husband had 3 children together by this point, but the husband also had children from a previous marriage. The Taliban wouldn't allow girls to go to school, and with the Sharia law, women weren't allowed to go outside without men escorting them. Eid's stepfather wasn't allowed to work. Their daughters couldn't leave the house without an incredibly high risk of being kidnapped. The Taliban would and could raid their house at any time to look for documents connecting them to the West. One of the sons from this previous marriage did actually work for the Australian government as a translator. I don't know if anyone remembers the story in the news, but there was a mass exodus a few years ago, and Americans and Australians were sort of evacuated from the country. And anyone connected to Australia or the US had to flee Kabul. The Australian government gave the son, who was a translator, a place on the plane to flee the country. The day that Eid's stepfather took his son to the airport to escape, a bomb went off. The father was injured. I think he was beaten as well, but the son got away. The son had to destroy all of his identification and papers, as he was a target for the Taliban and would have been killed if they found him and any connection to what his job was. The family believe he escaped to Iran, which is also not a safe place for him, but they haven't heard from him since. So obviously it was too dangerous for the family to stay in Afghanistan, so they fled to Pakistan. However, Pakistan wasn't much better. The Hazara, or the Afghani refugees, they were treated like dirt and they had no rights. They weren't allowed access to the internet. They weren't allowed access to banking. They weren't allowed to have jobs or licenses, meaning they couldn't drive either. So what were these people supposed to do? Aziz and Karima would send money back to their family regularly to help them survive. But it gets worse. 12 months ago, the Pakistani government made a ruling to round up all of the Afghani refugees and deport them back to Afghanistan. There was no place for these people to go back to. They were homeless. They had no place, not in Pakistan and certainly not back in Afghanistan. As I said earlier, the Hazara are hated by their own country. They're persecuted. They're told they don't belong anywhere. Mum assisted Eid to apply for refugee visas for the family. This was an incredibly difficult task. They had to do interviews with the Australian government via Microsoft Teams. How can they do this without phones or the internet? They had to gather documents. These had all been destroyed. But after months of work and waiting and stat decks and all of this extra paperwork, the family were finally accepted to come to Australia. Eid's mother, his stepfather, and his 3 new siblings. Mum asked if I would be a contact person for Immigration Australia for the family, because they needed someone in Brisbane as a contact for housing, so I was happy to agree. So when the family was due to arrive, Mum asked me if I wanted to come to the airport to meet the family too. I was very keen. So this past Wednesday, Mum and I arrived at the airport. We spotted the new arrivals before Eid and the rest of the family had arrived. So we stood with them until Eid, Karima, their older brother, their spouses, and all of their kids came to welcome the family, finally. I don't cry a lot these days. No. But watching this family reunite after such a long struggle overwhelmed me so much that I had to fight the tears off a few times. I asked Eid's brother how to say welcome in their language, and once I made sure I was pronouncing it somewhat correctly, I went to the stepfather, shook his hand and said to him, welcome, and I think it's Shahamade, but I might have forgotten. Shahamade. It was at this point he burst out in speech that Eid had to translate for me, and he was saying that all the Australians they'd encountered so far were so kind, and they were all so grateful to come here. I turned to the other members of the family and repeated the one and only word that I could say to them, and kissed the mother on the cheek. They thanked me, and I was like, I've done nothing, it was all my mum. Mum and I left because I had to go back to work. And our family all packed up into their cars to go home finally and commune with each other. And then Mum later on had dinner with them later on. And if anyone's interested, I've got some photos that I can show you. Mum said to me as we were leaving, these people have not been welcome anywhere their whole lives, and that broke my heart. These were beautiful people, and I find it incomprehensible to hate a person because of their heritage, skin colour, religion, or whatever it is. Eid and Karima's husband Aziz are beautiful men. The whole family together are loving and gracious, caring for their children and their nieces and nephews all together. My heart also broke for Eid's brother, whose toddler daughter was obviously going through chemotherapy, and we later found out that she had leukemia. These are good, kind people, God's people, and I'm just so glad to have met them and to have been privileged to witness them all reunited. So, to be honest, I just wanted to tell you their story and then sit down and be done. But I do think that there are some things that we can take from this story and relate to our faith. So what biblical command comes to mind when you hear Eid's story? The clue was the Bible readings. Right? Exodus 22 and verse 21 says, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Can I sip your water? Because the one thing that I forgot. Did I read the verse or did I just say what the verse was? Did I? I'll just read it again. Yeah. Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. This verse establishes a moral obligation for Israel to treat strangers with compassion, as they had experienced oppression as foreigners in Egypt. Leviticus 19 verses 33 and 34 says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing amongst you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So this passage elevates the care for strangers to the level of self-love, similar to the second greatest commandment in the New Testament. Deuteronomy 10 verses 18 and 19, as Laura read before. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Here, God himself is described as one who protects and provides for the vulnerable, including the stranger. It is a central theme in both the Old and New Testaments, which emphasizes hospitality, justice, and love for foreigners, often referred to as strangers. The Bible repeatedly commands God's people to treat strangers with kindness and fairness, reminding them that they were once strangers themselves. In Matthew chapter 25, in verses 35 to 40, and I'm just going to paraphrase a little bit here. It says, for I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. Jesus equates caring for strangers with serving him directly, reinforcing the importance of hospitality and kindness. You know, Jesus wasn't even welcome in his own home or in this world. He was literally a refugee for the first couple of years of his life. And then he was rejected by his own people and crucified. John chapter 1 verse 10 says he was in the world, and the world came into being through him, and yet the world did not know him. The second verse I got Laura to read was Hebrews chapter 13 in verse 2. It says, "Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown hospitality to angels without knowing it." This verse encourages believers to welcome strangers, as it could have divine significance. I often think about how many angels I might have come across in my life and not realised it. So I've read out a few verses, but how can we glean some further meaning from these? So I've got 3 points. 1 is the reflection of God's character. Caring for strangers reflects God's justice, mercy and love. 2, it's a moral responsibility. Just as Israel was once a stranger in Egypt, they, and by extension us as Christians, are called to remember their dependence on God and extend that grace to others. And 3, to point to the gospel. The Bible portrays all believers as spiritual strangers in this world, making the call to welcome the outsider even more significant. Caring for strangers is a direct reflection of God's character, embodying his justice, mercy and love. Throughout Scripture, God reveals himself as a defender to the vulnerable, commanding his people to show compassion to the foreigner, the widow and the orphan. By extending kindness to strangers, we mirror God's love, demonstrating the same grace that he offers to everyone. This is not merely a social duty, but a spiritual practice that brings together human actions with divine attributes. In showing love to outsiders, we participate in God's redemptive work, making his presence known through tangible acts of care and justice. And I really want to emphasize the word tangible. The call to welcome the stranger also carries deep moral responsibility, rooted in Israel's history and Christian identity. Just as the Israelites were once foreigners in Egypt, entirely reliant on God's deliverance, they were commanded to extend that same grace to others. This principle carries forward into our faith, where we as believers should recognize our own dependence on God's mercy. The New Testament calls all believers spiritual strangers in this world, destined for a heavenly home. This reality makes hospitality not just a duty, but a profound act of sharing the gospel, reflecting God's inclusion of outsiders into his family. By welcoming others, we embody the transformative love of Christ, looking to the promise of the eternal kingdom where all who were once estranged are brought together through his grace. So what practical elements can we pull from this to go forward and live out these principles in our everyday lives? I've chosen 2 things to focus on for now, and I feel like these are the very least things that we can do. We can welcome immigrants and refugees, even visitors, with compassion, and we can practice hospitality in our communities and church. Welcoming immigrants and refugees with compassion means recognizing their inherent dignity and the hardships they have endured. I liked in Nikki's prayer that this kind of came up. Many people flee their homes due to war, persecution or economic instability, seeking safety and a better future. By greeting them with kindness, offering support, and helping them integrate into society, we have the opportunity to ease their transition and foster mutual understanding. Jesus was the embodiment of compassion. A compassionate approach ensures that immigrants and refugees feel valued, respected, and empowered to contribute positively to their new communities. All I personally did for Eid's family was welcome them with a smile, handshakes, and a single word, which honestly felt wholly inadequate, but it seemed to mean the world to them. In a church context, this goes beyond simple generosity. It is an intentional effort to create spaces of belonging and inclusion. Hospitality involves opening our homes and churches to those who may feel isolated or displaced, offering meals, friendship, and emotional support. Faith communities in particular have a unique purpose in welcoming strangers, embodying values of love and service. And as a quick aside here, I travelled quite some years ago on a cruise, and we went through Fiji, New Caledonia and Vanuatu, and every place we went there were Seventh-day Adventists. And on the ship I made a new friend who wasn't Christian at all, but he was blown away by how many SDA connections we had wherever we went. And he was like, how many of you are there? But it's true, we have a unique sort of connection worldwide of this community. So by fostering relationships with newcomers and marginalised individuals, we can help bridge cultural and social gaps, creating a more connected and understanding society. True hospitality is not just about providing for immediate needs, but about affirming the worth of every person and building lasting bonds of solidarity. And I don't think we should see this as a duty necessarily. I think it should actually be just a natural side effect of our faith. Do you agree? We just need to lead with compassion, as Jesus did. He was compelled to action by his compassion and his relationship with God. In the years that Mum has taught EALD, she's had Sudanese kids who were child soldiers. She's had kids who were tortured by ISIS. She's had kids who've witnessed genocide, just a whole range of traumatic events. I've met some of these students and I've heard about others. So some of these include two Iraqi sisters, Farah and Nargis. They had to come to Australia separately from their parents, coming as boat people through Indonesia. They had to flee because their father was targeted by the government, and one of their sisters was actually shot and killed in front of Farah on the way home from the school. The family has since been reunited, but you can imagine the trauma that still sits with this family. Mum is currently tutoring a Yazidi boy in grade 8. His older sister is missing, taken by ISIS and presumably as a sex slave. His father was killed when his mum was pregnant with their 6th kid. The family was captured and taken underground and tortured for 2 years. That family has now made it to Australia, but they have profound trauma. And that baby that the mother was pregnant with is now in grade 5. Another one was a boy called Samir and his grandmother, who were fleeing, but they were separated from the rest of their family. At one point, soldiers were taunting Samir's grandmother, and he tried to intervene and protect her. As punishment, he was held down, had petrol poured on his legs, and he was set on fire. Mum saw his legs, and he's had several surgeries since, and he can walk normally again. And in his recovery, he's now decided that he wants to be a doctor. These are just a handful of their stories, but I can tell you the stories of other people I've met over the years. If you even think of the Burmese refugees, there's the Rohingya, there's the Karenni, the Zomi groups, they're just a few of them. But they have no home in their own country, and the countries they fled to didn't accept them either. I've got a Zomi friend who said that her family members, they hide in like ditches in their gardens whenever there's any raids coming through because they're afraid of dying. It's prevalent in so many countries, and you know it can happen in here too. So I just want us to think about this for ourselves. I'll be honest and tell you that I felt pretty uninspired this week and was basically crowdsourcing ideas for my sermon in a desperate attempt to find something to talk about. And then I had this experience on Wednesday. I truly just felt like I needed to share Eid's story with you. I can only speak to you from my experiences and my understanding, but I do want to thank my parents for being the examples of God's compassion with how they've lived their lives and shown us kids how to be, and for the opportunities I've been given to meet all these different people. It all boils down to the commandments. Love your God and love your neighbour as yourself, regardless of who that neighbour is. Look around our congregation today. So we've got Colombian, we've got PNG, we've got somewhere in Asia, I don't want to say. So America, Brazil, we've got people from everywhere. Think of all the visitors we've had over the years, and even some of the people who've never been to church before, or those that feel isolated and lonely in their lives, and they come here to find community. It's our job to look after them. That's it. I'd like you all to stand as we sing a song called I Speak Jesus. I think we've sung it before after a sermon I've done before, but to me it's like a prayer, and I hope you appreciate the words.